This video has the rather odd name of historical pressure to continue implementing bad naming conventions in databases. This video is in anticipation of future videos regarding what I think naming conventions should be, what you should consider adopting. And those videos, as well as this one, will be strongly opinionated in order to emphasize the importance of issues. We'll see that the most important guidelines will be to enforce consistency and predictability, which, if they're not the same thing, are very close. But there will still be influences which you may not be able to mitigate easily or at all, which will frustrate efforts for consistent and predictable naming conventions. And if we bring them to the forefront of your mind, it's going to help you fight them if you can. Now, there are multiple reasons that there might be bad naming convention. You may have existing applications where there's database design and existing application code from legacy application. And those things were created with limitations using tools that no longer exist in modern database and application development tools you're using now. But changing them risks breaking too many things. They may be too hard to re-engineer, and there may be unwillingness to change even where effort is minimal. Now, not exactly in the context of naming, but just in the context of poor design and re-engineering, SharePoint is a beacon of an example of something that was designed poorly. Microsoft didn't expect it to get to $1 billion in sales per year more quickly than any product it had ever sold. As a matter of fact, it wasn't even sure it was a product. It was designed as an example of things that could be done with .NET. But once they had it, there are things that were done poorly that they have felt they couldn't update due to compatibility with new releases, and then other things that they won't update just out of stubbornness. By the way, I like SharePoint a great deal as a user when it has good performance. I think it's a fun product. You can pay Microsoft a good deal to criticize your products and make suggestions, but they really don't have much ability to look inward. I point out SharePoint not for naming conventions, but just for the fact that there's a lot of times there are things we can't do things about, things we won't do things about, things that are difficult to do things about. So we see that there are historical limitations from these legacy applications and databases. Now, having good names very often means having long names. And this causes a formatting concern, which is legitimate. If you have long descriptive column names, we have headings that are often much wider than the data in the column. And when we run queries, we get these ugly, wide result sets with vast, unhelpful white space, where our eyes have to jump across wide rows in order to try to correlate data. But before you go nuts with the creation of shorter, less meaningful names, we need to think, and that will really be the subject of all of these videos together. When you make these decisions, make consistent decisions, but make good decisions. And we're going to see that there are going to be some rules for removing entire syllables from long names rather than just arbitrary vowels. Now, I just want to throw in here something sort of related that kind of goes to the major purpose for considering naming conventions. I think it is now scientifically proven that humans do not multitask, and this first bullet point has nothing to do in particular with naming conventions, even though the rest of the slide will. And I just want to point out that job descriptions that demand or prefer the employment of persons who multitask, which people do not exist, are telling you that when your supervisor shits on you, you should smile. People who are ADHD have more difficulty with this because they're already being distracted by themselves, and being distracted by other people who are inconsiderate makes things worse. End of that part of the rant. Now, I've gone my whole life avoiding comparison of brains to computers. It never really did much for me, but in this case, I'm going to make an exception. Applications and processes have threads, and they have context switches due to time slicing and the desire to do things that appear that multiple activities are occurring at once. And computers can do it well, but there is a price. When a processor goes from servicing one thread to another, the processor has to store the state information for the thread at the point that it is ceasing to run. It has to load the state information for the thread that it is going to execute. Then it has to continue that process as it cycles through threads. So there's a price. Computers can do that very fast. Now, this will help with throughput, but not necessarily response time for any individual task. And I'd like to make some videos discussing that because I think I can demonstrate some surprising results. The benefit for context switching that we see in computers is not seen with humans. Okay, you want me to say most humans? Fine. It's certainly not seen with this human. In my opinion, tasks that humans perform actually have aspects of threading as well as just executing single-threaded processes. This is reflected in the following point. A major goal is to be able to construct SQL statements and create other objects with minimal consultation of the schema and with minimal need to edit and correct queries multiple times because of confusing or inconsistent naming convention. Having said that, I want to make it clear that no rational person or even a manager expects a DBA to remember all table and column names as you create stored procedures, views, functions. But it becomes much easier to do so when we are working with a set of objects over and over again, and we don't have to constantly be thinking of certain things. And one of the ones I'll emphasize that's annoying to me is when we have some table names that are singular and some that are plural. Very often naming them singular and plural makes so much sense when we're creating them, but make no sense when we're writing statements with joins. Well, let's get to the history. Back in the 1970s, when I started working with computers, Fortran, for example, had 2-character variable names, so there was not a whole lot you could do in a complex project to give programming code meaningful names. Mainframes, which I did not have much familiarity with, had 8 or 10-character limitations for identifiers, and by that I mean things that would, in our current environments, translate to table, column, and other object names. All databases were in capital letters. They were converted to capital letters by default. Now that just seems rude. And back then we referred to people who worked in the computer world as working in the glass house. If you've ever seen a machine room from a mainframe, it's clear why many of them deserve that name. And they worshiped themselves, very full of themselves. And these people really were obsessively turf-oriented. And their tasks were divided and segmented even more than you might have in a large organization that's based on modern technology. And because there was a lot of turf, there was no motivation to make things understandable to other members of their priesthood, and having confusing, hard to understand names for things meant you were more dependent upon people who needed their egos stroked. Now we have a lot of the limitations on naming removed, and the insanity does continue for several reasons. And I feel the pressure myself, internally, from myself, for some of these things, even when I can control them. One of them is just inertia. You grow up writing 8 or 10 character variable names, you keep doing it. It's part of the culture to be cryptic. We may try to convince ourselves that, if we have 8 or 10 character variable names, table names, column names, that's going to make everything more efficient because the computer is going to have less work to do. You can try to convince yourself that. I'd like you to demonstrate that through measurement. The benefit that you're going to get by a maintainable application is going to way outweigh that. We like to be cool. We like to do cryptic, neat things that we see other people do. And it is my belief that in the computer field, we just hate the idea of people criticizing us because we're doing things in a way that is not reflective of the geekiness that we think we should have. We don't like people saying, well, I know that, or that you're being too silly by naming things. However, let me just say something that jumps in my mind right now. There was a project I wasn't working on many years ago, and it got behind, and they had to get people with minimal computer skills involved in it. They did result in some names that were really quite funny. One of them was Officer on Foot, Yes or No, and it had underscores between the words. That you can make fun of. I think we should avoid trying to be cryptic, trying to have short names, just because we think we're going to have our prestige diminished among our peers. I believe this actually exists. Once the limitations are removed, the limitations are, I think, largely self-imposed. We feel there's an expectation. We create expectation within ourselves. We don't want criticism. And we need to stop this. And I hope these videos persuade you to do that, give you the courage to do it, help you fight people who might work against you. I want to look and give some minimal examples of what I'm talking about, and I'm going to look at some of the table names on this slide. from a product that is currently called Microsoft GP. It's an accounting product. It used to be called Great Plains. Microsoft bought it from Great Plains. It is based on SQL Server. It wasn't always based on SQL Server. They gave you the great deal of flexibility of having many different databases. Look at those table names. Can you guess what any of them are about? Now, one thing they've done is give things prefixes that at least group them together. So if I find something and then I want something else related, I'm at least going to find it nearby. People who work with this product all the time do not see this as a problem, and I was outraged when I started working with it. I've since gotten to the point that I work less with it and somehow started being incorporated into the culture as well. I still don't think it's a good idea. Now, why do they have such awful names for tables? And why don't they use schemas? They could pull out those prefixes, give them meaningful names. Everything doesn't have to be in the DBO schema. I'm going to have videos here that talk about schemas. I think schemas are very important, very underutilized. But the reason is that this product had its overall schema designed, I believe, in the mid-1980s. And it was designed to support multiple databases, like maybe even DBase or something like that. So when you design it that way, you have to design it using names and concepts that are a least common denominator. Now, just as an aside, my mind tells me that that should really be most common denominator, but I know I must be wrong, and regardless of what it is, you know what I mean. Because it has to support multiple databases, it cannot use triggers and other things that enforce the integrity of the database, which I think is a very important function of a database. The database doesn't even have referential integrity to this day. And it's actually viewed as kind of a virtue. When Great Plains creates a master record with child records, one-to-many relationships, it will create the records on the many side first, and then you periodically run maintenance programs that will delete those child records if the parent record doesn't exist. In other words, rather than having transactions that roll back, they use the lack of existence of a parent record to show that a transaction failed. They think that's fine. For an application that would be designed today, I think it's crazy. Now, very often, especially in teaching classes, I have come across applications being designed that purport to support multiple databases, and I really think we're seeing less and less of that. I think people often use that as a reason to encapsulate business rules in programming components, rather than putting them in databases, in database-specific programming features, where I believe they belong. You can go ahead and put your rules in the components so that user interfaces don't have to make round trips to the database to discover errors, but the responsibility for protecting the data in the database falls with the database. And constraints need to be implemented there. I'll rant about that at some future time. Here I'm going to go ahead and show column names from some of the columns, from some of the thousands of columns in this database. I tried to pull out some where the column names reference some concept of number. Look at all the different ways that the word number is incorporated into column names. NBR. The word number, NO, NUM. I think this is crazy. I hope it's obvious to you. If I see from the comments that people just don't get why it's crazy, I guess I can rant about it some more. But this is not what we want. If I know something that is a certification number, I may not know whether we put certification as a whole word or not, but I should know how number is consistently abbreviated in column names without having to look it up. Every time I have to look something up, I am changing context of some kind of thread, so to speak, in my mind. This is annoying. This is distracting. This is frustrating if enough of it happens. To amplify some of the reasons that I think this happened to Great Plains, this database was almost certainly created by a team of application developers who didn't understand databases. They didn't talk to each other, and they wouldn't have known what to talk about even if they did talk to each other. They understood accounting. They knew how to create user interfaces. And so many applications are created with just that knowledge. They didn't give a damn about databases because application developers consider databases a nuisance and an inconvenience. I'm sorry if that is harsh, but that is true. It is my hope that this video has suggested some issues that have not been at the forefront of your mind that you begin to realize might be important, that might affect your productivity, your peace of mind, your product. That you appreciate the importance of intelligent names. There will be more opportunity to see examples of these in future videos. And that you watch those future videos in this series and others on this site. Please like this video if you like it. Comment if you have comments. Share it if you believe others would benefit from it. And please subscribe to this channel. Thank you.